Welcome to another episode of the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute and part of the Christians for Liberty Network. I am your host, Doug Stewart, and I have Dr. Cal Beisner, who is founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. And he is with us today to talk about a book he wrote a long time ago, but I came across and I just wanted to have him on. It's called Prosperity and Poverty: The Compassionate Use of Resources in a World of Scarcity. Cal was actually on our show back in episode 316, which aired a few years ago, and he's also been on the Reformed Libertarians podcast, also their episode 10. But Cal, thanks for joining us again. I really am looking forward to our conversation.
Well, thank you very much, Doug. Good to be with you.
Yeah. So I don't often pick up. I don't want to call this an old book because I mean this was around when I was alive still. So I don't often pick up books that have people who have addressed these types of issues before. But I knew that you were a good source to hear from on this issue of prosperity, poverty, and then really what caught my eye, to be honest, is the compassionate use of resources in a world of scarcity. Now, this was published in the late 80s, and I read your book. And I'm just like, wow, this is like super relevant even today. Now, there's probably going to be a few things we can talk about that are, here's what's different about the world from 1980s to the 2020s. But in any case, back when it was written, what were some of the things that kind of prompted the publication of that book? I believe it was part of a series, right?
Yeah, it was a part of the Turning Point Christian Worldview series that Crossway Books published. The idea for that came basically from Marvin Olasky and Herbert Schlossberg. And to my understanding, they came up with that idea because they were both involved in the Coalition on Revival, which was an organization started in 1984 by the same man who had founded about a decade before, a little less than that, the International Council on Biblical Inerrancy. The International Council on Biblical Inerrancy, or we can call it ICBI, first produced the Chicago Statement on Biblical Inerrancy, affirming that the Bible is inerrant in everything that it teaches. And then it produced the Chicago Statement on Biblical Hermeneutics, setting forth principles of interpretation. And it produced a statement on the essentials of a Christian worldview. Now, the late Dr. Jay Grimstead, who had founded ICBI, wanted ICBI to go on from there to say, okay, now we've got this inerrant Bible, we have these principles of interpretation, we have this basic stuff in terms of Christian worldview. How does all that connect to our daily lives? How does it address? How do we understand the application of all of that to philosophy, psychology, law, government, history, economics, arts, media, journalism, you name it, education, right? And most of the folks involved with ICBI didn't want to go down that road for a variety of different reasons. So he started this new organization, Coalition on Revival, and got initially about 130 evangelical leaders from around the United States and the world involved to set forth basic sort of white papers, position papers on biblical worldview applied to all these different aspects of life. And Marvin Olasky, who's best known as having been the editor-in-chief of World magazine for quite a long time, he also wrote the wonderful book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, and quite a few other books. Marvin and Herb Schlossberg, the author of the marvelous book, Idols for Destruction, were involved in that, as was I. And in fact, I was the chairman of the economics committee. And so they had the idea of a series of books that would take the basic ideas out of these white papers and build them into full-length books. And they asked me to do the volume on economics, and later another volume on population and resources and environment, things like that, which became the book Prospects for Growth, A Biblical View of Population, Resources in the Future. So that's kind of how the series from Crossway came about. My own interest in this stuff started when back in early 1981, it would have been, I first read Ron Sider's book, Rich Christians in an Age of Hunger.
I was just going to bring that up. You're like reading my mind here.
Right.
I guess it's in the air, right?
Yeah. I read that book and I thought to myself, I had never studied economics before that, but I had studied a lot of logic. I majored in philosophy at the University of Southern California under the late, great Dr. Dallas Willard. I had studied a lot of logic, and I'd also studied a whole lot of biblical interpretation, commentaries, books on hermeneutics, and so on. And I thought, golly, I love Ron Sider's heart in this book. He has a real compassion for the poor and the suffering. But I think that with the very best of intentions, he's endorsing economic policies that would actually be more harmful than beneficial.
Yeah.
But of course, I didn't know anything about economics. So I went and bought a stack of textbooks on economics and read them and began to learn. And that kind of got me off in that direction, which led to Dr. Jay Grimsted's invitation for me to chair the economics committee of the Coalition on Revival. And I found that as much as Sider had misused logic and misused scripture, he'd also misused economics. And I can say this, by the way, starting with the third edition of Rich Christians, Sider backed off of the highly socialistic approach that he had in the first two editions, and became much more friendly to a free market, private property rights approach to economics.
Yeah. Nobody's asked me to write a book on economics, but my journey kind of feels very similar to the way that yours was that you came across something that had a lot of good energy behind it. If to use a kind of a new age term, honestly, that's kind of dumb, but that he had compassion for the poor, and he really wants to see the Christians take care of those who are on the margins. But then there's something wrong here. And that was very similar to my journey as well. And I know Sider's book was somewhat influential, especially with like the Sojourners, sort of Christian left and more mainstream or more mainline denominations. And he still actually holds a good bit of sway. I know he passed away recently in the last couple of years, but do you feel like there was a lot of
Christianity Today magazine about a year ago, I think it was, maybe a little bit longer than that, named Rich Christians the most influential evangelical book of the last 50 years.
What do you make of that assessment?
I think it's probably quite right in terms of influential.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of sad that book had such great influence because, in fact, most people read the first couple of editions, and by the time of the later editions, it wasn't selling as well.
Right. Yeah.
And so most people got the socialist perspective out of that.
Yeah, it's pretty unfortunate. And I want to lead this to one of my original first questions, although we've had conversation here for a few minutes. The very first paragraph in your book, I'm going to read this, and I'm going to sort of say this tongue in cheek that I think you're wrong, but you'll kind of get the point here. You write, this is literally the second sentence: "We cannot afford to promote prescriptions for the cure of poverty that are worse than the disease." And I was thinking, well, Cal, you and I can, but you know what? Who can't afford it? The poor people.
Yeah, right.
And I think, isn't that
to some we there?
Yeah, I know that. Well, and honestly, the church can't afford to have the wrong views on this. I mean, I understand your point.
Right.
I'm using that as a lead-in to say, you know what? Part of the reason why this is so important, I think, to you and somebody like me, is that it is the poor people are poverty is too important to be left to us experimenting on things like socialist ideas.
Yeah, and if I'm on a libertarian Christian podcast, to say that I used the collective we,
no, it's all good,
might be a little bit problematic.
No, it's more like the royal we. It's like, hey, we the church,
right? In economics, pretty much everything that's collective is disastrous. Whereas
true. Well, you understand
private
that
property and voluntary association, that tends to work pretty well.
Yeah. Well, I want to talk a little bit about stewardship and just get a sense of where does the concept of stewardship fit in your way of looking at theology? Like, how would you describe, to put it simply, what is your theology of stewardship?
Well, we have to start with the basic meaning of the word, the Greek word oikonomos, from which we get our word economics and our word economist. And oikonomos was in the days of Jesus, the New Testament period, someone who didn't own, but who managed the property owned by someone else, who stewarded that for the purpose of ensuring that it would bring a good return to the owner. He would have control over the household goods. He would have control over the servants, the people who worked for the owner of things. He would have control over the raw materials and the tools and everything else. And his job was to ensure that the owner got the best return possible. We have an example of that in the parable of the talents in Matthew 25. And there we have three different stewards. Each one is entrusted with a certain amount of money and told to go out and use that for the master's benefit. One comes back and he has doubled, another comes back and he's doubled, and another one comes back and says, "Master, I knew that you were a hard man, reaping where you did not sow. So I just buried your talent in the ground. Here it is back to you." And the master says, "Oh, you knew that I was a hard man, reaping where I didn't sow? Huh. Then you should at least have deposited my money in the bank so I'd get interest on it. I mean, the safest deposit you could do." And then he condemned that steward and said that he had to be thrown out into darkness where there'd be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Of course, the steward, that wicked steward, and unprofitable, the master said, had completely ignored the fact that the master had sown. He had sown that talent into the steward's hands. And so he would not be reaping where he hadn't sown. He would be reaping where he had sown. He had provided the capital necessary for production of profit. And that production of profit is the very thing that we, as stewards to God, are called to do. In, for instance, the dominion mandate or the cultural mandate, some people will call it, of Genesis 1:28. God, having created Adam and Eve in his own image, male and female, blessed them and said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it and have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and everything that moves on the face of the earth."
Yeah.
Well, what is that dominion supposed to look like? We get the picture from the previous verses of Genesis 1, because our dominion, since we're made in God's image, should reflect God's dominion. What did God do? Well, he started with nothing and got everything. That's even better than absolute profit, because of course, percentage of nothing would still be nothing. God started with nothing and got everything, right? Started with darkness and got light. Started with disorder and chaos and got order. And started with no life and got life and great abundant variety of life, and told every part of the life to reproduce after its kind. So God is a profit maker, and he wants us to be profit makers too.
Yeah.
And the way we make that profit is by transforming the raw materials that we find around us into useful things that serve others' needs, and then trading with them. And of course, the more we can specialize and the more they can specialize, the higher our productivity, and therefore the higher the total produce per person. And that's how people come out of poverty, because after all, poverty is the natural condition of mankind. Naked I came into the world, naked shall I leave. The great question is not what causes poverty. The great question is what causes wealth.
Yeah. No, are you familiar with John Walton's view on Genesis 1, the temple analogy and house and home dichotomy?
I am, and I think there are some aspects of his view on that are helpful, but I also think that he basically subjects the reading of Genesis to the reading of a lot of other ancient Near Eastern texts in a way that essentially makes them the authority over what Genesis means, instead of making the rest of the Bible the authority over
Okay.
what Genesis means. And
well, what
I
prompted
would differ significantly from him on that part.
Yeah, well, what prompted me to think about that was the house versus home dichotomy. And if for those who aren't familiar, the house would be like, how do the raw materials get built and get here? Is in his view not the purpose of Genesis 1, but how did God create the home? And it seems to fit with what you were saying there in terms of like having dominion and working together in all the proper ways to bring about a healthy creation that we can live in harmony, shalom, and without poverty.
And I would say that rather than an either or, it was a both and in Genesis. And I think there are other parts of Scripture that bear that out, but that's probably pretty well outside the.
Well, no, that was just the only thing I thought of. It was that the establishing a place for humans to dwell and for all of creation to be at harmony is definitely something that corresponds with what you've got there.
Right.
And so, yeah. So
and that fits too, by the way, with what we see in comparing Genesis 1:28, fill the earth, subdue it, and have dominion over it, with 2:15, where God, having made Adam, places him in the Garden of Eden to cultivate and guard it. So we have two different geographic places here. The Garden of Eden is one small part of the earth with boundaries clearly described. And that is already, we might say, maximal. And it's a wonderful Edenic, place, right? But outside that is wilderness. And if we follow the theme of wilderness through the rest of Scripture, we find Scripture does not see wilderness as a very good thing. It sees wilderness as a real problem. Adam and Eve were called to start in the Garden of Eden, cultivate and guard that. Guard it from what? From the encroachment of the surrounding wilderness, and then to multiply, go out from the garden, fill the earth, and subdue all of that to turn the rest of the earth into garden as well.
Yeah.
And that is the task of our economic activity.
Yeah. Okay. So the question about, like, as you kind of mentioned with the word for steward is kind of where we get the word economics. As is very obvious, and from the start of our conversation, we talked about your reading of Ron Sider, and of course that he didn't at the time really kind of comprehend a basic economics, and so that influenced how he thought about justice, and it influenced how he thought about terms that we would now, maybe they also called it back then, social justice. And that conversation is always sort of at the forefront of when Christians debate about economics and poverty and wealth and what is the mission of the church to those around us, especially like the marginalized. And so what are your thoughts on the word social in front of the word justice? Is it a misnomer? Is it something that's like, well, that's technically true in one sense, but not how anybody's using it? I don't mind the word, but when I can't use the word the way I want to use it because I don't own the word. So where are you on that conversation?
Well, historically, the phrase social justice came from the work of actually a Roman Catholic scholar in the early 19th century. Can't remember the name right at the moment. And what that scholar meant by social justice was the idea that is reflected in many Roman Catholic social documents by the phrase, the universal destination of all goods. And the idea is that justice requires the equal, or at least closer to equal than current distribution of things among people. And so where there are inequalities, there's necessarily injustice. Now, I think that is an entirely unbiblical definition of justice. In my book, Prosperity and Poverty, I wrote a couple of chapters on the nature of justice. And where that came out of was that first I had looked up every instance of both the Hebrew and the Greek words translated just, justice, right, righteousness, etc., and studied them in their original contexts. And I concluded that a biblical definition of justice based on its actual usage in Scripture would be justice means rendering impartially and proportionally to everyone his due according to the righteous standard of God's moral law. So there's impartiality. That means you don't play favorites, right? All the rules have to apply to everybody identically. You don't play favorites for the poor. You don't play favorites for the rich, right? There's proportionality in an exchange. Each of the partners in the exchange has to value what he receives better than he values what he gives away. That's the proportionality of an exchange. But in, for instance, retributive justice, where we are punishing a crime, punishing sin, the punishment needs to be properly proportionate to the harm done. So you had, for instance, what's called the lex talionis, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, and so on. A lot of people read that and they say, "Oh, that's barbaric." No. I'm sorry. That was not what you needed to go out and do. It was the limit.
Yeah, right? It was raising the bar, so to speak. Yeah,
right. You were not allowed to go beyond what was the harm that had been done.
Yeah.
So there's impartiality. There's proportionality, and then there is conformity to a standard. You have to have a standard that transcends everybody, or else everybody brings his own.
You can't have impartiality if there's no standard.
That's right, and the standard is the moral law of God, summarized, of course, in the Ten Commandments, but unpacked for us in many helpful ways in both the moral and the judicial or civil laws of the Old Testament. And so if we go to these, then we can get an understanding of justice that allows us to navigate all of the different claims and counterclaims in our surrounding society in a way that is mapped out for us by the Lord himself in his word, instead of a highly subjective approach.
So you talk about in your book the personal domain of justice and then a social domain of justice, and that's obviously where this kind of conversation can sit a little bit. And when it comes to looking out at the world and seeing wrong, seeing inequities or inequalities or just outcomes such as poverty.
Inequities and inequalities, by the way, are not the same thing.
No, I agree.
Inequity basically means injustice.
Yes,
but people have stolen that term
in
more recent decades.
Yeah, so as you look out, like a lot of people are going to look at that and they're going to arrive at certain conclusions about how that happened. And what do you recommend for people like listeners to this show who kind of understand where we are on this conversation, mostly I'm assuming, to communicate to others? How do you communicate to others that the analysis of why someone is poor is probably not because someone else is rich? Like, how do we get to the fact that social justice isn't I looked up the Catholic's name. I can't pronounce it, so I'm not even going to try. The guy that you said came up with the meaning of the word social justice. If he's wrong, then what is the proper way to analyze things when you look at a result that's, hey, this person is poor, or these people group are poor, or whatever it might be?
Yeah, there are various different causes of poverty, and we need to treat them differently. A great natural disaster can cause poverty, right? Or crime can cause poverty. Crime against the person who's poor, or the person who's poor may be involved in crime, is caught, is punished, and is left poor because of that. Laziness can cause poverty. Proverbs, go to the ant, you sluggard.
Yeah.
And see how it works very hard all through the summer to prep, food for the winter. All of these things can cause poverty, and we need to carefully identify what's the cause in any given instance. There are situations where one person's poverty is caused by another person's wealth. Those are situations where private property is not adequately respected and protected, where somebody basically steals from another. And that stealing might be in violation of the civil code or the criminal code, or it might be written right into the criminal code or the tax code, for instance. So we see, for example, in communist countries, the nomenklatura, the apparatchiks, they would thrive on the backs of the ordinary folks, the proletariat, because they claimed, oh, all the property belongs to the state, and that way it gets shared by everybody. But the problem, of course, was the apparatchiks get their first grab, and what's left is what gets down to the ordinary folks. So what we need to do is to try to carefully examine what's behind poverty in this instance and what's behind it in that instance, and then fit our response to it appropriately. Now, the natural condition of mankind, as I said before, is poverty, right? Naked came I into this world, naked I will depart. And so the interesting question is, where does wealth come from? And it comes from being productive. But then we also have to understand that our productivity is limited by the extent to which we understand God's creation and we understand God's instructions for us about how we are to use God's creation and how we are to relate to each other in our using of God's creation. And this is part of why, as I argue fairly late in my book, Prosperity and Poverty, for pretty much the whole history of mankind, like 99.9% of all mankind were extremely poor. That is, they lived at a subsistence level where any given day might be the last day that they have enough food to stay alive. That was the case for almost everybody until practically the early Middle Ages. And then you began to have, I believe, the flowering of the Christian worldview and the understanding of this world around us, the development of science and technology based on that biblical worldview that an intelligent God designed the universe to be ordered in such a way as we, made in his image, could understand and use. And we would learn that through experimental method. That, by the way, is itself based in a biblical text, 1 Thessalonians 5:21, test all things, hold fast what is good. You have a hypothesis, you test it, and you do that over and over again. You find out what really works. Bit by bit, we learned how to use God's world better and better. And then we had the Reformation, in which the availability of the Word of God spread immensely to more and more people. And whereas what you could call early capitalism did begin before the Reformation, it really flowered with the Reformation. And this is why the areas that were the most heavily influenced by the biblical worldview were the areas that grew out of poverty into prosperity earliest. And the places in the world that today are the most prosperous are the ones that have been the most influenced by that biblical worldview, which, by the way, is discussed in a wonderful book that I can't help recommending, and that is Vishal Mangalwadi, the book that made your world. This is an Indian Christian philosopher who's writing to us in the West saying, you all are turning away from the biblical heritage that shaped your civilization. You're like fish in water. You never think about the water, but here it is. You're getting thrown out of this water, and you're going to be gasping for breath in a minute. You better look carefully at what you're abandoning.
Yeah, that sounds very similar to Glenn Scrivener's book, The Air We Breathe. I don't know if you're familiar with that. We recently had Glenn Scrivener on the show for to talk about that. It's one of my favorite books in the last couple of years. Because you're totally right. Even the people who are even atheists are actually using Christian rhetoric and foundational reasoning to argue against things.
Yeah. And more atheists, too, are coming, shall we say, out of the closet and saying, look, I may not buy Christian theism, but I sure buy cultural Christianity. I realize now culture, the Christian culture is the one and only thing that brought justice, order, liberty, and prosperity to this world.
Yeah.
And as the West, the secularized West, turns against that, we're seeing the breakdown of order, justice, liberty, and prosperity.
Yeah, they're recognizing this. I think some of the wiser ones recognize this at least a decade or more ago, and not just now because it's a little bit, it's a little bit hip to to come out that way. But sure.
Right.
I want to get back to the Christian response to poverty. What is your take on whether or not? So you and I would both agree that markets would be the best thing for anybody who's poor, right? Like from a human history perspective, we want to have great allocation of resources, and free markets are pretty much the only thing we've discovered so far that will actually deliver that within God's moral framework. And so,
although we should make a difference, we should distinguish between the poverty that is brought on suddenly by a natural disaster, in which case it could very well be that it's going to be charitable activity that is first going to bring supplies into this place to respond to that disaster. That, though, should be short-term because it can't be sustained long-term. Markets are what produce goods on a long-term basis. And frankly, for instance, laws against so-called price gouging or lumber following a hurricane or a tornado or something like that.
Or a pandemic.
Those laws are, those laws are absolutely counterproductive, because exactly what you want is for high prices where that hurricane hit to attract lumber from other places where it's not as badly needed at the moment. The sooner you get that movement going, the sooner the need for lumber there will be met and the prices will fall. But if you have laws against those high prices, that's when instead of high prices, you get black markets.
Yeah. Well, so you actually brought up, you answered without me actually finishing the short-term nature of certain solutions, whether it's either, something like price gouging in that sense, offering better, the price signaling going in the right direction. But what about short-term opportunities like, it's funny, I don't even think charity as a short-term solution. So I wasn't even thinking about it in that sense, because yes, you can be charitable outside of market conditions, but it's the free market that would allow everybody to donate, right? Like, we're all prosperous enough to help the people in an emergency because we have some sort of profitable extra. Whether it's, I don't want to say we, I'm gonna commit the we sin, right? We, generally speaking, as Americans, could in theory help support all of the people in North Carolina without government coercion, and because we have a market that can sustain that kind of thing, because we have savings accounts that can kind of help that. But what about short-term solutions like welfare solutions that are for the absolutely desolate? I don't mean corporate welfare. I don't mean just the impression that a lot of people got in the 90s about welfare queens and all that. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about the truly destitute. What is your take on letting either the state or some sort of local governance sort of kick in a little bit on that?
Well, I'll tell you what. I've got a neighbor who really is quite destitute. And so I'm going to come in and break into your house and steal a bunch of your stuff, take it down to the pawn shop, sell it, and give that money to my neighbor.
Yeah.
You like that idea? No.
Well, I wouldn't personally like that, except there are people who would say, well, if that's really what my tax money is going to, that's okay with me.
Well, but my point is this. I've studied a lot of Old Testament. I've read a lot of commentaries on the Old Testament and the like. I have never yet found reference to the variant reading in the Ten Commandments that says that the eighth commandment is actually, thou shalt not steal unless thou art the government. right? And
I'm gonna clip this for YouTube, man. We're just gonna run this over and over on our channel. That was great.
Yeah. The fact is that whenever the government takes what belongs to some people to give it to other people to whom it doesn't belong, that's theft, regardless of the recipient. Now, there are legitimate purposes of government, basically law enforcement and national defense. What government needs to do those, it has to employ people for, and those people should be paid appropriately for what they're doing. But all other transfers of money, whether to the rich or to the poor, remember, by the way, justice is impartial.
Okay.
Exodus 22 explicitly forbids playing favorites to the poor. It also explicitly forbids playing favorites to the rich. So government should not be taking from some to give to others to whom it doesn't belong. Now, what about charity? What can we do? Well, I argued in the book, Prosperity and Poverty, that if in fact all the members of America's churches back at the time that I wrote that were actually tithing to their churches, and at the time, by the way, the average giving was, if I remember correctly, a little bit less than 2% of income, but a tithe is 10%. If all the members of all of America's churches were tithing, the revenues of those churches would be considerably higher than all the money that was being used at the time for our federal government and state government welfare programs. The issue is not whether there's enough money out there. After all, the government can only spend money that it takes from its citizens anyway, right? The issue is
best case scenario is it's just management overhead. That's best case.
Right. Yeah. And believe me, that is best case, and it is not true case. The real scenario is that most of that money winds up lining the pockets of the people who run the programs. I'm not saying that they're stealing it, they themselves. I'm saying that they are getting their share of the stolen goods, and a majority of what gets taxed away, supposedly to support welfare programs, doesn't wind up going to the poor. It winds up going to the people who run the programs. But we certainly have enough means to meet all of those needs charitably. And, some people will say, yeah, but the church failed to do that. They need to read Marvin Olasky's book, The Tragedy of American Compassion, where he shows historically what happened. The social work movement basically intentionally crowded charitable organizations out of the task of taking care of the poor, and moved that task to government because they had bought the notion of social justice that said, we need to have a far more equal distribution of wealth because that's what justice is. And therefore, what the poor need is not charity. That's an insult. They need social justice. And by saying it was justice, they justified having it done by the state, by the government, instead of by private individuals. But that has been a horrendous misuse, inefficiency of the use of this wealth, as well as a violation of basic biblical moral principle.
Yeah, well, I would certainly agree. I realize that we could just have all the Christians read Marvin Olasky's book, but if you were to advise any sort of Christian leaders, whether they're pastors or whether they're just leaders in organizations that are in the poverty reduction space, how do you recommend we get from what is probably still an underperforming giving program? It may be more than 2% nowadays. Who knows? Might be less, might be more, but it's probably not tithing.
Much more, if at all.
It's probably not, right? So so give more. What is the solution to this? I mean, how do you advise people to begin turning this ship around on the Christian side to deal with the issue of poverty in a biblical, moral, and actually even effective way?
Yeah. Partly, we need to go ahead and compete with the state. In my book, Prosperity and Poverty, I cited the work of Reverend George Grant, later Dr. George Grant, which he described in his book, Bringing in the Sheaves, about the diaconal work of the church he was pastor of in Humble, Texas, back in the, I think, starting in either the late 70s or early 80s. And that church's deacons decided that they wanted to apply biblical principles to helping the poor in their particular area. And so they reached out to people, they befriended them, they discipled them, they taught them work skills, even taught them such things as setting an alarm clock and getting up on time and getting to work on time and things like that. Bit by bit, discipling and imparting skills so that they began to take care of themselves. The result was, over a period of time, don't remember now how long, that the local welfare office lost all its clientele and had to close down because the church had done its job there. I think churches in many places could do essentially the same thing. What we need
making the state obsolete, basically.
Exactly.
At least in that
aspect of the state obsolete. What we need to remember is how we truly help the poor. And for that, I'll recommend another book. And that is the book When Helping Hurts. By Brian Fickert, and I've forgotten the co-author's name.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. Yep.
This is all about how many, many different things that we do thinking that we're helping the poor, like sending a boatload of used shoes or used clothing to some remote poor village in a sub-Saharan African country. We think that's helping. It does briefly, some people. But what it does over the longer haul is it puts out of business all the people in that community who repair shoes, who make shoes from scratch. When we just simply give money or give material goods, we are undercutting incentive for market activity, which is what actually lifts people out of poverty long term. So we need to essentially evangelize and disciple, and we need to have a vision of discipleship that is broader than just teaching you how to pray and read your Bible and tell others the gospel and be a good husband or wife. We're getting a little closer there, right? Because a good husband and wife make sure that their children are well provided for and so on. But discipling is for the whole of life. And when we do that, people become productive. And then they aren't poor anymore.
Is there anything in this conversation that you'd like to add to before we wrap up? Any thoughts that came to your mind that we got lost in conversation you want to add to wrap us up here?
Well, I think probably the main focus that's needed right now is to correct the notion of social justice. That is so widespread, and especially among young people. And for that, there is, of course, my book, Prosperity and Poverty. But I've developed that notion better and more substantially in a booklet called Social Justice versus Biblical Justice: How Good Intentions Undermine Justice and Gospel. That, by the way, is available through the online store of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. If people just go to cornwallalliance.org/shop. That's cornwallalliance.org/shop. If your listeners will go there and order a copy of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice, we will be glad to send that to them. Or, in fact, instead, if they will go to our donation page, cornwallalliance.org/donate, and make a donation of any size and request it, we will be glad, as our way of saying thank you, to send them a free copy of Social Justice versus Biblical Justice.
Excellent. Sorry, I'm humorously chuckling here because this book that you say is updated. I'm like, I read this book that you published, Prosperity and Poverty, which is like 200 and some odd pages, and I could have read your booklet in prep for this.
Yes, but you'd have missed everything else in that book.
Yeah, so true. I totally, it just made me chuckle inside, and it caught on camera, so I had to explain why I was laughing on camera. So anyway, that's the nature of these newfangled video shows, right?
They're fun.
Yeah. Well, hey, Cal, I really appreciate that you came on to talk about this. I really appreciate your perspective. I hope to have you on again sometime, and I wish you well at the Cornwall Alliance.
I'd love to do it. I really look forward to an opportunity to talk specifically about the work of the Cornwall Alliance, educating the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, which is not the same thing as environmentalism, and economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Christ, together with the biblical worldview, theology, and ethics that underlie that. We had the great privilege of being mentioned by Megan Basham in her New York Times best-selling book, Shepherds for Sale: How Evangelical Leaders Traded the Truth for a Leftist Agenda. The very first chapter of that is on the creation care movement, much of which is heavily funded by left-wing billionaires and their foundations to embrace basically leftist approaches to environmental stewardship. She writes about us that we are one organization that didn't get bought off that way. And what she says about us is so laudatory, it's almost embarrassing, but I'm really glad to be able to recommend her book. It's a great book, and many evangelical Christians really need to read that.
Yeah. Well, that's excellent. Well, thank you, Cal. And I appreciate everything you're doing and for coming on the show with me.
Well, thank you, Doug. Take care. God bless.